Chapter 21. Breathe. Stephen stared at the clock on the wall. What if he couldn't lift the mallet? What if he dropped it on his toe? What if he dropped it on Mr. Kidswatter's toe? He could be expelled! Breathe, said Jason from the desk next to him. Stephen took a breath. He stared at the clock. What if someone left a skateboard on the stairs? Then he might trip over it on his way to the gong. If he broke his leg, Mr. Kidswatter would yell at him for being late. Breathe, said Rondi from the desk on his other side. Stephen took a breath. He stared at the clock. Sometimes it seemed the hands didn't move at all. Other times he'd blink, and it would be half an hour later. Time didn't always make sense at Wayside School. For lunch, Miss Mush made pepper-only pizza. Stephen ate his slice, but did not remember eating it. His only clue was that he was very thirsty and his tongue and his lips burned. He returned to his seat in Mrs. Jewell's class. He stared at the clock. Jenny was running late coming back from lunch. "Oh, sorry, Mrs. Jewell," she said. "I can't find my skateboard." "Oh, no," Stephen shouted. "Are you all right, Stephen?" Mrs. Jewell asked him. "Why did he have to pick me?" Stephen moaned. "If you didn't want to do it, why'd you raise your hand?" asked Mac. "Well, everyone else had their hands raised," Stephen explained. I guess I was excited about it at the time, but now..." "You just have cold feet," said Mrs. Jewell. "Yes," exclaimed Stephen. He wondered how Mrs. Jewell knew that. His feet looked like 2 blocks of ice. No wonder she was a teacher. But what did his frozen feet have to do with the ringing the gong? "Breathe," said Mrs. Jewell. Stephen took a breath. Mrs. Jewell's class always had music on Friday afternoons. "I'm sorry, we don't have musical instruments today," she announced. "They were sent out to be cleaned, and we haven't gotten them back yet." "What if the gong was being washed too? What if we have to bang it on a different day?" "Breathe," said Kathy, and Stephen took a breath. "So just use what you were born with," said Mrs. Jewell. "And a 1 and a 2. Dana loudly blew her nose. Ron twiddled his lips. Mac puffed out his cheek and popped it with a flick of his finger. Calvin and Beebe whistled. Joe stood on his head and sang Jingle Bells. Paul pulled Leslie's pigtails. She shrieked, squealed, and squawked, depending on the pool. "Stop the music!" Mrs. Jewell suddenly shouted, and the room became instantly quiet. "Oh, Stephen, you're late," she told him. "I'm sorry, I was so carried away by the music, I didn't notice the time." "Time?" said Stephen. "Now, Stephen," said Mrs. Jewell. He remained frozen in his chair. Mrs. Jewell asked Jason and Rondi to help. They moved to either side of Stephen and slowly lifted him to a standing position. "It's time, buddy," said Jason. "Time?" Stephen repeated. He took 1 step, then stopped. "Now the other leg," said Rondi. He took another step. "You can do it, Stephen," cheered Kathy. "Bang that gong like no one ever banged it before," called Joy. Stephen walked across the room. He stepped out the door. Behind him, he heard the entire class shout together, "Breathe!" And Stephen took a breath. Chapter 22. The Moment. Stephen was worrying his way down the stairs when suddenly he spotted Jenny's skateboard, right in the middle of a step. He stepped over it. Well, that was easy. And just like that, his fears vanished. Not even the cloud of doom worried him. He quickly hurried the rest of the way down. He didn't want to be late. When he reached the 2nd floor, he could see Louis below wheeling the gong into place. "Louis!" he shouted, and then jumped down the final 8 steps. "Am I late?" "You're right on time," said the art teacher. The gong was gigantic, almost twice as big as Stephen. He had never stood so close to it before. In the center was a small red dot. The iron mallet hung from a hook. The mallet was longer than his arm, and thicker too. Have you been doing your pushdowns? Louis asked. Stephen nodded. I'm almost up to 2, he said confidently. Mr. Kidswatter stepped out of his office. He took one look at Stephen and asked, Who are you? This is Stephen, said Louis. You chose him to bang the gong today? Him? Why would I choose him? Because you're the best principal ever, said Louis. Well, yeah, that's true, said Mr. Kidswatter. I'll do my best, sir, said Stephen. That's what worries me, said the principal. Louis handed Stephen 2 cotton balls. As Stephen was stuffing them in his ears, Louis unhooked the mallet. He held it out to Stephen. Stephen wobbled as he took the mallet with both hands. Louis helped him raise it to his shoulder. Mr. Kidswatter checked his watch, then started the countdown. 10, 9, 8. He had to shout the number so Stephen could hear him through the cotton balls. 7, 6. Stephen tightened his grip on the handle. 5, 4. Stephen groaned loudly as he slowly raised the iron mallet up off his shoulder. It was a good thing he'd been doing all those pushdowns. 3. Stephen staggered, but maintained his balance. 2. He concentrated on the red dot. 1. He swung with all his might and missed. He didn't just miss the red dot. He missed the whole gong. Louis jumped out of the way as the weight of the mallet pulled Stephen around in a circle. The second time around, the mallet banged into the gong right on the dot. Gong! Despite the cotton balls, the sound echoed inside Stephen's skull and rattled his bones. It traveled up the stairs all the way to the 30th floor. He did it, shouted Mac. Yay, Stephen, yelled Jenny. Everyone in Mrs. Jewell's class whooped and hollered. Louis kept Stephen from falling over and took the mallet from him. He hooked it on the frame, and then he and Stephen wheeled the gong into the principal's office. Mr. Kidswatter was already there, standing by the door. The principal held out his big hand and said, Well done, Stephen! In the history of Wayside School, Stephen was the only kid to ever shake Mr. Kidswatter's hand. In the future, whenever Stephen feels worried or frustrated or just plain sad, his mind will take him back to the moment the mallet struck the gong. He will close his eyes and see the red dot. His hands will feel the weight of the iron mallet. He will hear the sound of the gong bouncing back and forth between his ears and will feel the vibrations in his bones. And he will smile. Chapter 23. Blame It on the Cloud. Mrs. Jewell went from desk to desk as she handed back the math test. I'm very disappointed in you, Joy, she said. You need to learn your 6s and 7s. Joy had gotten an F. That awful letter was written in red ink, and there was a circle around it. But it wasn't my fault, Mrs. Jewell, Joy complained. It's the cloud of doom. It made me change my answers. Said Mrs. Jewell as she took another look at Joy's test. She made 2 little strokes with her red pen, changing the F to a B. Joy smiled. The door swung open and Bibi walked in more than 15 minutes late. Bibi, you need to put your name on the board under discipline, Mrs. Jewell told her. Oh, don't blame me, said Bibi. I left my house on time. The cloud of doom slowed me down. Oh, okay then, said Mrs. Jewell. Leslie screamed. Mrs. Jewell turned. Paul pulled my pigtails, she accused, both at the same time. Paul, what do you have to say for yourself? Demanded Mrs. Jewell. Paul shrugged. Cloud of doom? He tried. Leslie turned around and shook her fist at Paul. I'll doom you, you ugly bug sniffer. Leslie, that's no way to talk, said Mrs. Jewell. Oh, it wasn't me, Mrs. Jewell, Leslie said sweetly. The cloud of doom made me say it. Well, apologize to Paul for calling him ugly. But I didn't call him ugly, said Leslie. He sniffs ugly bugs. Jenny and DJ laughed. Mrs. Jules glared at them. Cloud of doom, they said at the same time. Mrs. Jules continued to hand back the tests. You could do better, Terence, she said when she came to him. Terence crumpled his test into a ball and brought it to the front of the room where he dropped it in the trash. He stood there a moment, staring at the trash basket. Terence, return to your seat, ordered Mrs. Jules. He stayed where he was. Terence, do you have a problem? Asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Terence. No problem. He kicked the basket. It sailed end over end across the classroom, spilling trash along the way. Mac raised both his arms like a football ref. 3 points, he declared. Terence! Exclaimed Mrs. Jules. Sorry, the cloud of doom made me do it, said Terence. Mac, said Mrs. Jules, you know better. Cloud of enough! Shouted Mrs. Jules. I get it. It's hard with that cloud hanging over us all the time, but you can't blame it for everything that goes wrong. You have to take responsibility, and that means working extra hard so things don't go wrong. So now I'm doubling your homework. Oh, that's not fair, complained Benjamin. Mrs. Jules told Benjamin to write his name on the whiteboard under the word discipline. The ultimate test will start Monday, Mrs. Jules declared. It will take 3 days to complete, and you better be prepared. Cloud or no cloud. There were lots of groans. Mrs. Jules returned to Joy's desk. She crossed out the B and this time gave her an F-. Terence, there's a broom in the back closet. I want you to pick up the trash basket and sweep the floor. Mac will help you. Everyone else, get in line behind Benjamin and write your names on the whiteboard under discipline. There were more moans and groans as everyone rose from their seats. Except you, Todd, ordered Mrs. Jules. You're the only one who's been good. Todd sat back down and scratched his head. You used to be a nice teacher, said Rondi as she made her way to the whiteboard. Why are you so mean? Asked Allison. Mrs. Jules just shrugged and said, Cloud of doom. Above them, the dark cloud continued to churn as it turned itself inside out again and again. No one hardly noticed it anymore, but it continued to grow larger and more powerful each day. Lightning flashed inside the cloud, where no one could see it. Thunder boomed where no one could hear it. What happens in the cloud stayed in the cloud. For now. Chapter 24. The Ultimate Test, Day 1. The 4 unbreakables met by the flagpole before school. Don't worry, Mauricia, said Joy. When you get sent back to kindergarten, I'll still be your friend. Thanks, said Mauricia. I know you'll do great. Nobody can jump rope like you can. True, Joy agreed. And Ron's memorized every page in the dictionary, said Dee Dee. Ron smiled. Joy is a good speller, too, he pointed out. You always get 100% on your spelling tests. True, Joy agreed. And one of Dee Dee's legs is shorter than the other, said Mauricia. Dee Dee smiled. Just lucky, I guess, she admitted. They locked thumbs and pinkies and shouted, Unbreakable! Mauricia glanced up at the cloud of doom, then followed her friends into the school building. I hope everyone's ready, Mrs. Jules greeted her class. You just need to remember everything you've ever learned in your whole life. The children looked nervously around. The test would last 3 days. Each day would have several little tests and one major event. On day 1, the major event was a spelling bee. You mean we have to spell the words out loud? Asked Joy. That's how a spelling bee works, said Mrs. Jules. Joy did a lot better when she could write the words. She was a master of fudge squiggles. If she didn't know the letter, she made a fudge squiggle that could have been any number of letters. Mrs. Jules always gave her the benefit of the doubt. All the children stood along the wall as they waited for their turns. If they missed a word, they would have to sit down. Mac couldn't spell curious. Leslie missed squawked. Jason went out on confidential. Dilly-dally, said Mrs. Jules. Dilly-dally, Todd repeated. He got every letter right, but left out the hyphen. It's not even a letter, he protested when Mrs. Jules told him to sit down. Jenny missed skateboard. Joy was next. Helicopter, said Mrs. Jules. Helicopter, Joy repeated. H-E-L. She was stuck. She didn't know if there was one or two L's, and she didn't know if the letter after that was an E or an I. If she could have written it, she could have made the perfect fudge squiggles to cover all the possibilities. She returned to her seat. Dee Dee was eliminated on eliminated. A short leg didn't help with spelling. After a while, only 3 students remained: John, Ron, and Mauricia. Spectacle, said Mrs. Jules. Spectacle, John repeated. S-K-E-P-T-I-C-A-L. Only Ron and Mauricia remained. Orchestra, said Mrs. Jules. Murmurs could be heard around the room. Nobody thought Ron could do it. Orchestra, Ron repeated, and then spelled it perfectly. Vacuum, said Mrs. Jules. Mauricia wasn't sure if there were 2 C's and 1 U, or 2 U's and 1 C, but she guessed right. Mrs. Jules closed her dictionary. Well, that's all the dictionary words, she announced. I guess I'll have to use words that aren't in the dictionary. It was Ron's turn. Thruple-dub, said Mrs. Jules. Ron had memorized the entire dictionary. How was he supposed to spell undictionary words? May I have the definition, he asked. It's when you count to 3 and fall asleep in the middle, said Mrs. Jules. Oh, that's easy, Ron said, then correctly spelled the word, the non-word. Fudge squiggle, said Mrs. Jules. Mauricia spelled it perfectly. She even included the hyphen, having learned Todd's earlier mistake. Whumph, said Mrs. Jules. Again, Ron asked for the definition. It's the sound made by a jump rope as it brushes against the ground, explained Mrs. Jules. Ron gave it his best shot. W-H-U-M-P-H. Oh, I'm sorry, Ron, said Mrs. Jules. There are 2 M's in whumph. I win, Mauricia exclaimed. The class cheered, and Ron felt cheated. If it's a made-up word, who gets to decide the number of M's? Mauricia's smile was big and bright. Ron was not smiling. Chapter 25, Jump Rope Arithmetic. On day 2, the major event was jump rope arithmetic. It is just what you'd expect from the name. The children had to answer arithmetic problems while jumping rope. They earned 1 point for each jump of rope. They could choose either to use 1 rope or 2 at a time. 2 ropes were harder, but the points added up more quickly. If they answered a problem wrong or tripped over a rope, they were done. Joy, of course, chose 2 ropes. This was her special talent, like Joe's upside-down jingle bells or Dana's funny faces. 4 plus 7, asked Mrs. Jules. Woomph. 11, replied Joy. Woomph. 2 points, and she'd only had to answer 1 question. Woomph. 3 times 9. Woomph. 20. Woomph. 7. Woomph. She continued with ease, skipping lightly over the ropes while rattling off answers. Lewis and Miss Nogard turned the ropes for her. Miss Nogard was everyone's favorite substitute teacher, especially Lewis's. By the time Joy reached 65 points, nearly everybody else in her class had finished jumping. Ron had earned 23 points. Dee Dee only got to 6. Jumping rope wasn't easy for her since 1 leg was shorter than the other. DJ had the highest score so far with 84 points. In the history of the ultimate test, nobody had ever broken 100. Woomph, woomph. 12 divided by 4, asked Mrs. Jules. Woomph, woomph. 3, said Joy. Woomph, woomph. A circle of children had formed around her. They cheered each correct answer. Go, Joy, go, shouted Mac. When she reached 80 points, even Mrs. Jules started to get excited. 38, woomph, plus 14, woomph. 52, woomph, woomph. She was now tied with DJ. 100 and, woomph. 43, woomph, divided by, woomph, 11. 13. Everyone took up Mac's call. Go, Joy, go. Go, Joy, go, they chanted. Louis and Miss Nogard's arms were getting tired, but they continued to twirl the ropes. They knew they were part of history. Joy was now up to 99. Go, Joy, go. Go, Joy, go. Woomph, woomph. 29 times 4, shouted Mrs. Jules. Woomph, woomph. 116, Joy easily answered. Everyone whooped and hollered. That's a new world record, exclaimed Dee Dee. Woomph, woomph. 6 times 7. Brap. Joy lay sprawled across the blacktop. 6s and 7s always tripped her up. Still, she had broken 100 and set a new world record. Her classmates rushed up to her. You're the best ever, said Kathy. True, Joy agreed. There was one jumper left. Woomph. 16 minus 11. Woomph. 5, said Mauricia. Mauricia used only one rope. Miss Mush and Mr. Pepper-Ratter turned it for her. She jumped with both feet at the same time and held her breath every time she jumped. Woomph. 9 times 8. Woomph. 72. Woomph. Joy continued to lay on the blacktop as she listened to the slow woomphing. She imagined the solid gold trophy with her name on it. Her picture would be in the newspapers all around the world. She'd go on TV where famous people would ask her questions about jumping rope and arithmetic. Maybe they'd even put her in a movie. When she came out of her daydream, she was surprised to hear the jump rope still woomphing. 0 times 1,000. Woomph. 0. Joy sat up to see that a circle of kids had surrounded Mauricia. They cheered every one of her answers. Woomph. She headed over and poked Todd in the back of his neck. What is her score so far? 66, he told her. Joy wasn't too worried. She was sure her best friend would ramp at any moment. She didn't start to worry until Mauricia reached 80. Woomph. 16 times 17. Woomph. 272. Woomph. Well, sure, Joy thought bitterly. 16s and 17s were a lot easier than 6s and 7s. In the end, Mauricia ramped on an easy one. 2 plus 3. She probably was just tired. She had been jumping for almost an hour and had 211 points. Joy didn't see her fall. She had quit watching a long time before.